Okay, now let's remember what we spoke of about the rules of scope. If you remember, we learned that anything which is enclosed inside of an opening and closing brace, whether it's a while loop or a for loop or a if statement or a else statement, or even just a plain old opening and closing brace just like that, if you wanted to make a nice code block inside of your code, and of course inside of a function which also opens with an opening brace and closes with a closing brace. So without going into all the details, pretty much every level of opening and closing brace has its own territory of the lifetime of variables. So any variables created in that world, in that level of scope, is considered local, which means that that variable will be destroyed as soon as the function returns, as soon as the function finishes. And we even learned that even when you pass variables into functions and you try to do stuff to make those variables change, it still won't help, because when you pass variables into functions, all that happens is that a local copy of the variable is made. So like right over here, when I made a function called increment, which takes a variable, integer x, and increments it by 1, and then in my main function over here, I create my variable y, I print out what it has, and then I try to increment it. But when I print it out again, of course first by giving it 0 or something, I find out that the increment function didn't help. It stays 0, even though I passed the variable into the function to increment. And that's of course because when I pass the variable into the function, the variable itself isn't passed in, but rather a local copy of the variable is passed in. So it's pretty annoying that my functions which I create can't help me with changing variables of one scope in another scope. What good are functions if I can't make them change variables around, even variables of a different scope? One sort of a solution would be to make the function return a value which I could later on assign to one of my local variables in the main function. So now that this will return an expression of that number incremented, and then I assign it to my local variable y, then we sort of have a function, a different scope, affecting our variables in our scope. The problem with this, of course, is that I can only do this one expression at a time, one variable at a time. If I want to have an increment function which increments 3 different variables, I wouldn't be able to do that. I can't return 3 things from a function. I can only return 1 thing from a function at a time. So it still is annoying that a function can only affect variables of a different scope, only one variable at a time. Here's another bad solution which you can try, and that is to make variables which are in the global scope. What's the global scope? Well, anything which is outside a function, or a class method, or a class. Until now we've been creating variables only inside the main function or inside some other function, but the truth is that just like you can declare a function declaration out in the open like this, not inside of a function of course, the same thing you can even create variables out in the open, not inside of a function. Just like this function over here belongs in global scope, which means that pretty much anyone can call this function without any restrictions because, for example, it doesn't belong to a class, it's not a method of a class, it's a function which is out in the open, it's in global scope. Same thing is with this variable over here. Pretty much anyone could access this variable, everyone could see it and everyone can change it because it's a global variable. It's not limited to some specific function, to some specific scope or class. So for example, now I create this xyz, a global variable, and I give it 0. Now in my main function I could right away start using this variable xyz without even declaring it, because I've already declared it right outside over here. And because xyz is a global variable, anything I do with it will really change it. Not like when you were passing variables into functions which would make local copies and it wouldn't change anything. When I change global variables, the change really takes place. So right now the real xyz doesn't have 0 anymore, it has 10. And we can try to print it out and you'll see. Then when I call the increment function, at this point I'm just passing it 0 because I have to pass in some sort of integer. but I'm not even passing in xyz because I don't have to, it's global. In the increment function, again, I assign 11 to this global variable, and again, I didn't have to declare xyz because, of course, it's global. Everyone knows about it. And then when I return and I get back to the main function and I print out xyz again, we will see that xyz has really changed and it's not 10 anymore, it's 11. As you see right over here, 10 and 11. So it does work with global variables, and of course not just global variables, but even global objects of your own classes that you yourself created, that everyone could see it in every single scope, and everyone can change it, and everyone has access to it. There's no limitations about scope, it doesn't get destroyed when a function returns, and that's it, every scope has access to it. Of course, without getting too deep into all the details, because every other scope is inside the global scope, so just like if I create a variable x in an outer scope, and then I make another variable x in an inner scope, then all the rules apply like we mentioned in a different video. Pretty much the same rules will apply if I made a global variable xyz and then I create another integer xyz in a local scope. Okay, now why is global variables a bad idea? Very simple. Because it is totally going against every single rule in the book of object-oriented programming. The whole idea of limited scopes is that unlike in older programming languages where everything was everywhere and you had thousands of functions all over the place and thousands of variables all over the place, in an object-oriented programming language we have things ordered in a more orderly fashion. Things logically belong to each other and things are supposed to be limited and packaged up in different packages. So the idea of making lots of variables which are open for everyone totally doesn't fit with the idea of object-oriented programming, besides the fact that once you get into the bad habit of using global variables, your code will start getting real buggy when you start losing track of who makes what kind of changes to what global variable, and suddenly pieces of code start to not work anymore because you were expecting the global variable to have a certain value, but of course since everyone can access the global variable, so some piece of code somewhere else where you forgot about changed the global variable in a way you didn't expect, and you barely have control anymore over exactly what the global variable is supposed to be. So it's a bad idea to just pass around the key to access a global variable to everyone in the program, because again, if anything can go wrong, it will, and you will probably lose track of who's changing the global variable in which way. So do yourself a favor and do not use global variables, at least not for most of the time. Okay, so what's the solution to the problem of scope? How can we possibly take advantage of functions and class methods to make them actually change different variables of different other scopes? It's so annoying that a different function, a different scope, can't change around, can't take effect on variables of another scope. Well, C++ does have a solution, and that is by using a special type of sort of variable called pointers, and also something else similar to pointers which is called references. The general idea is something like this. When you just go on your own merry way, creating different functions and then creating different variables inside of these different functions, and you're just letting the program take care of itself, then the program by default of course will take care of its variables on its own terms, the way he wants to do it, which is of course by enforcing the rules of scope. However, you don't have to leave it all up to the program to take care of all your variables. If you want, you have the power of taking care of your own variables yourself. And when you declare independency and decide to take care of your variables by yourself and not to just leave it up to the program to take care of, then you can make your variables live on your own terms, and so of course you can sneak around the rules of scope. Because you're not just letting the program take care of all your variables, you decided to take up the responsibility to take care of them yourself. So basically, by digging a little deeper behind the scenes to figure out how to manage your own variables by yourself, which is a little bit advanced in a way, then you can have the power of avoiding the very limiting rules of